With no further ado, I'm just going to introduce our main speaker for this evening, and apologies for anybody that knows me, I will have to read off the script because I've got a memory like a sieve. So, this is Dr. Bhavin, a theoretical physicist and biologist, interested in evolutionary theory and inference, genotype and phenotype mapping, virus evolution, and chromatin polymer physics. He is currently a research fellow in Statistical Genomics at Imperial College London, where he also undertook his undergraduate and master's degrees before moving to the University of Leeds, where he completed his PhD on, and I quote, single biomolecule conformational viscoelasticity. Is that right?
Exactly that, yeah.
Perfect, close enough. It was much better than the hash I made of the previous speaker's PhD thesis anyway. In between, he's taken numerous roles in places such as the University of Surrey, Edinburgh, Cologne, the National Institute for Medical Research, and the University College of London. This evening's talk is on the subject of physics and biology within a world where physicists take for granted the universality of laws of physics, but are there universal laws equivalent in biology? Hopefully that's what we might find out tonight. So over to you, Val. Thank you very much. North staff's welcome to Dr. Bhavin.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for a very nice talk. You introduced a somewhat similar sort of idea about the evolution of the universe, but the evolution of life on Earth and what's physics got to do with that, of course. So I start by, here we go, just crashed again. Okay, I might have to stand here. That's fine. So, a big question you might want to ask is, what are the most important unsolved questions in physics? You may wonder. We have a punter already. Go for it.
A unified theory of the standard model and relativity.
Awesome, yeah. That's a very, very important question. Any other ideas?
Big stuff, small stuff. Big stuff, small stuff.
Big stuff, small stuff. You mean like going from quantum mechanics to classical physics? Yeah, that's a very important one.
Using the first talk, will protons decay or not?
Okay, yeah. That's not on my next slide, but here we go. So, like we just mentioned, grand unified theory, string theory, quantum gravity, these are all very, very important problems, of course. And we would like to understand this from a physics point of view, of course, and these are unsolved problems. Dark matter, of course, and dark energy, which you talked about just now, is very important and unsolved. But, as you might guess from the title, I would have a slightly different viewpoint. So there's a very famous quote by Stanislaw Ulam, who asked, "Ask not what physics can do for biology, ask what biology can do for physics." So what do you think that means?
Is he basically degrading biology as a field and saying that physics is more important? Or?
I don't think he's quite doing it, no. It's ask not what physics can do for biology, i.e., so we can model, we've been very successful in the past 40 years, 50 years of modelling systems in biology using physics, like the Brownian motion of proteins, and I'm going to talk about that now to some degree. So we can use physics to understand biological processes. But what he meant was that biology itself, as a phenomenon, is unsolved, or we don't really understand it from the perspective of physics. Okay? And so it begs the question, what is life as a phenomenon of physics? So we have this very large complexity and diversity of form of life. How can we explain this? Biology is existence, its origin, and its continued evolution is essentially an unsolved problem for physics. Is there an equation of life that can explain something? Does it look a bit like this, say? Yep. The rate of change of something must always increase, or maybe it decreases. We don't know. So, when we talk about life, it's very natural to talk about thermodynamics and entropy. So second law of thermodynamics says the entropy of a closed system must always increase or stay the same. So we have a partition with two different types of gases or molecules. We remove the partition, they mix together. Yep. It's very, very difficult to unmix them. And this is the idea that things tend towards more disorder and become more mixed. So entropy is a measure of disorder. And systems, and the way I like to think about it more is a bit less mystical, possibly, that systems just tend towards states of higher probability. Yeah? It's not that mysterious, and hopefully I'll convince you of that. So, when you talk about the second law and you think about life, it feels like there's some sort of paradox, right? You start from early life on Earth, or not life, early chemistry on Earth, prebiotic chemistry of just nucleotides and things like that. And then eventually got to single-celled organisms. And then after that, multi-celled organisms with a high degree of complexity. So it seems, if you look at this, that the entropy of these systems are decreasing. Right? It looks like we're basically creating more and more order, and this is what's going on. The second law of thermodynamics says this should not happen, right? So what's up? What's the catch? So this is the thing that Schrödinger and also Leo Szilard pondered at the beginning of the 19th century, and essentially their idea, which I'm going to talk about now, is, so the second law says the entropy of a closed system must always increase, right? So imagine we have an organism, like Donald Trump. He's this ordered, complex thing, and so the entropy has decreased, right, by forming this organism. Yep. Go for it.
It's not a closed system because the organism has to eat and it also has to excrete.
Yep.
Which means that it's not which means that the amount of mass and energy in the organism is constantly changing.
Yep, it is. So what do you think my next
So what's happening?
slide is? Or next
it's
point?
going to be exactly that.
Something like that. Yeah, so that's true, yeah, and so basically there's heat given off, yep, into the environment, yep. And so this means that it's not really a closed system, okay? Okay, you might think, okay, let's draw a box around an organism, or Donald Trump.
Let's put him in a cell for a
Or put him in a cell, possibly. This is being recorded, isn't it? And so the idea, this is the argument that Schrödinger and Szilard gave, is that as long as the entropy of some total system decreases, i.e. there's enough heat given off, which is disordered, to compensate for the order you create within the organism, then it's okay, it's all good. Is that good? Everyone agree with that? But Donald Trump, all the life on Earth is just one, living on this planet Earth, and it's an open system again, right? Because, okay, it's an open system, so let's draw a box around the Earth and all organisms in life. Is that now a closed system? Not really, right? Because we have the sun. There's energy coming from the sun, mostly through photons, which impinge on Earth. Okay, let's zoom out again slightly. I'm slightly out of sync with my own. Let's draw a box around the whole system, yeah, the Earth and the sun. Is that now a closed system? No, right? Because energy must leave the system. And so, what's going on, right? Does that mean the second law of thermodynamics is this argument by Schrödinger and Szilard is bunk?
Because the entire
At some point I think you're going to end up giving the talk.
the entire universe is a closed system.
That's true, yes.
So the energy,
Well, we think it
the
is.
total energy of the entire universe most likely increases, but
Total energy of the universe.
Sorry, entropy. Sorry, not energy.
Right,
Sorry.
yeah.
But although the entropy of any given system inside it may decrease if it gives off heat.
Yeah, sure. And so, okay, so there's a second law, yeah, which we can somewhat tells us that there's certain directions of things, but the thing is, the key thing is that life is an open-driven system. There's a the point you made earlier, is that there's a continual input of energy and matter, yep, into the system, and it's being driven, as opposed to being closed. So in some sense, the second law of thermodynamics must be correct at some level, yeah. If we think about it on a smallish timescale, yes, locally we must be having to obey this second law, yeah. But in the grander scheme of things, there must be something else going on. So the second law is consistent with life. Life doesn't disobey it, but the key thing, the second law can never predict life as a phenomenon. It just puts a bound on what can possibly happen. So the question is, what is the new physics needed to try to explain this? And I'm not going to give you the answer today, but I'm going to pose some questions. So let's go back to the question of what is entropy. So we have an ideal gas in a box, the classic example from statistical physics. So we say that there's no flow of energy inside or outside, or no matter can pass between. The first law of thermodynamics says the energy of the system must be fixed. And then the entropy basically says it's the log of the number of ways. Is a measure of entropy. Okay? And so slightly more mathematically, that's just this thing here. Log of omega, the number of states, which is going to be proportional to the volume of the box. And if we half the volume of the box, we decrease the entropy, of course. Now, what's going to happen now if I've got this box and I've got it constrained to a smaller region and then I let go of that constraint?
The entropy will significantly increase.
Sure, yeah. So, that's what happens. So the box is a constraint, the circular area was a constraint, and the release is a constraint, and the system just wants to explore this larger area. So systems spontaneously evolve towards states of higher probability or higher entropy, because it's essentially easier to find, right? So this talk is about evolution and biology. So the way we think about the entropy in the concept of biology is slightly different, because we have an organism like this orangutan, and we imagine looking at one of the cells in its skin, for example. The cell has a nucleus and it has these little machines called proteins which do things in the cell and form scaffolds and things like that. If we look at this protein, it's constantly fluctuating because it's at a constant temperature. Okay? So now this is essentially an open system, right? It's fluctuating at constant temperature, and the body is the larger system, which is providing this like heat bath, as it were. So those who've done physics will be somewhat familiar with these sorts of ideas. And so if we look at the energy over time of the protein, which is our subsystem, it fluctuates around. And temperature is basically nothing but the mean kinetic energy of that. As heat goes into the protein, the energy goes up, and as heat goes out, heat goes out, the energy goes down. Yeah? And so, an important question to ask then, if you have this protein, and it's connected to a heat bath, it's fluctuating, what's the most likely conformation of this protein going to be? So what I've done here is drawn a schematic, a sort of toy diagram. So my PhD was in theoretical quantum physics, so I like drawing strings and things like that. So here I've ordered them, the possible conformations by their compactness. So I have increasing compactness to the right. And we imagine that each time the protein, this chain, interacts with itself, there's a negative energy which allows it to be, attractive energy which allows it to be stabilized. So it can decrease its energy. And so the energy of the protein will go down as it becomes more and more compact. So what would you predict to be the minimum, what conformation will this protein adopt, do you think? And there's a, sorry?
A tight ball.
A tight ball, like this on the right. Any other answers? So considering that, clearly, I want you to consider entropy, right? Entropy is somewhere in this answer, which I haven't told you the full story about yet.
Somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between, which bit in between?
The middle one.
This one here or this one here?
The second one, yeah.
The second one.
Yeah.
It's a good answer. Everyone agree?
Like the state of most disorder. So it would, it would just become more and more random.
Out here?
No, the other way.
Oh, the other way?
Yeah.
This way?
In the way that it's being mixed together.
Yeah, so that's more and more, yes, that's partly true, but actually, it's not quite true, right? So the entropy of this protein, it increases to some point, but it starts decreasing again, it becomes more and more compact. It has less ways it can arrange itself in a smaller volume, right? And so there's a balance between the two, and this is what this thing called a free energy is, okay? So there's a balance. So if we consider what the entropy of the whole system is, we know the second law of thermodynamics must be true. The entropy of the whole system must increase. But if you focus just on the subsystem, we get this thing called a free energy, which tells us essentially what's happening with the entropy of the whole system. And the free energy says, actually, we need to balance the energy and the entropy together, right? And what we find is something in the middle here, which is this minimum free energy conformation. And this is essentially the one of the important achievements of statistical equilibrium statistical mechanics. Right, so I've talked about statistical mechanics of a protein in a cell, in our bodies. Now what about statistical mechanics of evolution, which is going towards the bigger question. So how can we explain all this diversity of life and form? How can we understand this in terms of physics ideas? So another very important quote is by Theodosius Dobzhansky, who said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except within the light of evolution." So in order to understand biological form and how it's related, we need to understand evolution as a process. So let's go back to our example of the orangutan. We can imagine again the skin cell. Now let's focus instead now on the nucleus. The nucleus contains the genome of the orangutan, which looks a bit like this. Oh, I've lost my pointer, here we go. So it's DNA. This DNA contains information about how this organism is constructed, okay? And it might be a nucleotide at this particular position, and this thing's called a genotype, and at some particular position, it might code for the colour of its skin, say. And the thing it produces is called a phenotype. Okay, so the genotype, we have a phenotype. The expression of what's going on of the genotype is called a phenotype. And say there's a mutation there, and it turns to a T. and then it changes the colour of the skin. It could change some other property. Okay? So this is how natural selection plays out. Okay? So imagine that there's a particular mutation that has a particular fitness associated with it. So it leaves a certain number of offspring. There's another mutation that might mean on average you leave more offspring. Okay? So this green mutation might be advantageous in some way. So imagine you have a population of individuals that have these green and red mutations. How's natural selection going to play out over time? People reproduce, they leave offspring. Okay? The green ones leave a few more than the red. We have finite resources in the environment. So there's a certain population size, and we assume it's constant. And then what you see is because there are more of the green offspring left, when you look at a constant population size, actually you've got more green left in the next generation. Same process happens again, and we have more green offspring. And so on and so forth. Until all we have left are the green allele. The allele is just a term for the type or the mutation, green mutation. So this is very powerful and provocative sort of picture of natural selection, which everyone thinks about. Okay? Natural selection is continuously optimizing and taking us towards more and more fit organisms and individuals. And so it's very common to see in evolutionary biology for people to write down, to show figures like this. You have some fitness landscape, you define the fitness landscape, and then we go up to the top. End of story. And then organisms are basically, all they're doing is optimizing their fitness, and so on. And so we have pictures of, for example, us, apes, many, many years ago, millions of years ago, progressing along this line of optimality towards us humans. Or even worse, diagrams like this, which trace a lineage all the way from single-celled organisms, through to fish, through to mammals, to primates, and then to us humans. And you even have the man thrusting his hip forward as if I am the best, I am the pinnacle of humanity. I wonder. So this is just a story. So this is not how evolution really works. And Darwin understood this, even when he was conceiving of natural selection as a theory of life and evolution. So actually, what happens is there's branching. Yep? Organisms split and they branch, and they're correlated. And so actually, if you look at the tree of life, there are many, many, many different branches of the tree of life. Okay? And this is essentially the whole of the history of life from the beginning of Earth. And humans are just one branch on that. One little tip on this tree. Yeah. Right, so if that's the case, what is the role of natural selection? So there's a very important idea in evolutionary biology, in evolutionary theory, which you probably don't really hear about. And so one thing you need to consider is that any mutation, even if it's a really great mutation, it has to arise in a single individual. Okay? One individual in a population. And so it may just be unlucky. Right? It gets run over before it can reproduce, or it dies or something like that. Yep. And so what we're left with is only red alleles. We lost that allele. We lost that good mutation. So this is called genetic drift. It's actually in some sense a bad word, but this is what they call it in evolutionary biology, genetic drift. And it's basically the randomness in the outcomes of evolution. So sometimes good mutations are lost. You can't do much about that. So actually the picture, we need to modify our picture slightly. So actually what happens is that you've got a rough, stochastic and varied walk towards the optimum. Yep. So you get to this optimum, and then actually it's difficult to stay there because you've got genetic drift taking you off. Yep. And the fluctuations around that optimum of order 1 over the population size. So if you decrease population size, you get more and more fluctuations. Yeah. So things tend to become less optimal. But there's a really important point. So fitness landscapes, if you do this sort of thing, yeah, if you draw a fitness landscape like this, they can be basically a tautology, right? I've put the answer in already, I've drawn this landscape and say, I want natural selection. Even the genetic drift in this way, all it gives me is just fluctuations around some optimum. But I've put that answer in by hand. So as physicists, we really care about emergent phenomena. Things are more than the sum of their parts, okay? We don't want to put the answer in, we want the answer to come out of simple rules. So it gets worse. So let's go back to our orangutan. So like I said, in each nucleus of its cells, there's a genotype. And there may be multiple mutations and different variations that give different expressions between the phenotype. Okay? So variation, the mutations and the variation happen at this level, but the thing we see, the thing that natural selection acts upon, is not here, but at the phenotype. Right? So what does that mean for our evolutionary dynamics and theory? So a picture or a cartoon is a bit like this. So imagine a space of genotypes. We have a smaller space of phenotypes. And there's many, many genotypes that give us a single phenotype. Yep. And then these then map to some fitness. Okay? What does that mean? Right, so a very good example of this is the protein structure literature. So we've become really, really good at crystallizing proteins and finding their structure. And so you see that so the greens are the number of different folds, different types of proteins. And we see that it went up exponentially and then we started plateauing. But on the left, the blue is the total number of sequences. The number of sequences kept going up, right? So how do you explain that? You explain that by the fact that there's many, many sequences that give you the same protein fold. Yep. So there's a redundancy. So I can pose this question. So imagine now this grid are all my different genotypes. Yep. And then the colour of the dot is the phenotype it expresses. So for example, this blue phenotype might have a fitness of 2. And the pink phenotype might have a fitness of 4. So it has far more offspring. So what happens in the evolutionary process? But considering the fact that actually the blue one has far more genotypes that code for it, will the pink phenotype always win? Is the question. What do you think?
There's going to be some critical fitness ratio which will allow it to increase.
Something like that, yeah. It's not a bad answer. So do you think natural selection is always going to work?
It will probably take a lot longer to happen.
For it, yeah, sure, because it's really hard to find.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
But once it has established itself, it will eventually take over.
That could happen. That's a very good answer. Yeah. So let's talk about this idea in the context of proteins, right? Protein evolution. So this is a central dogma of biology. So we have DNA that codes for messenger RNA, which is then turned into a string of amino acids. And those amino acids are then they fold into this protein structure, okay, which has this minimum free energy conformation that I mentioned before. And so proteins do things in the cells. They're the workhorses of the cells. They, for example, bind to DNA to turn on the production of other proteins. They can be antibodies, which bind to foreign things within our bodies to turn them off and to try to stop infections. Or like actin, they can be basically like the scaffolds within cells we have. And their stability comes from all these different interactions, okay, within the protein. So there's things like hydrogen bonds, electrostatic interactions, and hydrophobic interactions, which give you the stability, right? But there's a curious thing. So if you actually look at the stability of proteins across a whole database of proteins we've actually crystallized, and you measure their stability, so this just tells us what stability is. If we go more to the left, it becomes more and more stable. And the bar tells you how many proteins do we see of that particular stability. Yep. And we see that the peak is around -5 kilocalories per mole. Okay? But the free energy of a single hydrogen bond is only about 1 to 6 kilocalories per mole. Okay? So what's going on? Why aren't proteins more stable? With your evolutionary biologist hat on, what would you say? What's the most obvious, intuitive thing to say? You'll all be exposed to this idea of natural selection being the all-encompassing force behind evolution. So what are we missing? So we would think that our landscape might look something like this. We want really stable proteins, right? So we have fitness versus stability, and there's a peak at some maximum possible stability where all these interactions are satisfied. But that's not what happens, right? We're somewhere, did I say a hand raised? No? We're somewhere in between. So the classic thing to do is say, wait a second, we're missing something. We must be missing something. We don't have the full picture, right? So there's something else natural selection is acting on, which is preventing us from getting to maximum stability of proteins. So, for example, they may be floppy. They may need to be floppy on average, okay? So if there's some sort of floppiness requirement, then actually the peak of the landscape is no longer at maximum stability, right? How do you feel about that argument? So this was critiqued by two very famous evolutionary biologists back in the 70s? Late 70s. With a very elaborately titled paper called The Spandrels of St. Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the adaptionist program. So I'm going to read out that segment. So the adaptionist program has dominated evolutionary thought in England and the United States during the past 40 years. It is based on the faith in the power of natural selection as an optimizing agent. It proceeds by breaking an organism into unitary traits and proposing an adaptive story for each, considered separately. Trade-offs amongst competing selective demands exert only a brake upon perfection. Non-optimality is therefore rendered as a result of adaptation as well. Okay? So what's he saying? What are they saying here? That was a bit quick, but so the idea, the thing about the Spandrels of St. Marco are this, okay? So we look in churches and cathedrals, we see these very beautiful architectural features. So it's very easy to think, oh, they must have been designed by the architect to begin with. Yeah? This was there by design. In the same way we think natural selection must have given us less stable proteins, right? But actually, if you just consider the fact that you need to put a dome on 4 arches, or any number of arches, you will always get a spandrel. Okay? There will always be this triangular area which happens to look attractive. And then you'll put things in there, iconography and things like that. Yeah? So it's not a product of the design as such, it's a byproduct of the constraints. So then maybe evolution then does take it further, or in this case the architect or the designer, but it's not there by design. And a similar thing about, if we look at a fossil record, and we look at, for example, Archaeopteryx, the temptation is to say, okay, I see feathers on this dinosaur. What's the temptation to say? That they flew. They could fly. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it could fly. Yes.
They can fly. Yeah. So the thing is, the jury is still out on whether Archaeopteryx could fly. And in fact, there's another idea that actually feathers originated originally for thermal regulation. Okay? And so natural selection acted there, and then there's a word called exaptated for the purpose of flight. So maybe birds they had these feathers for thermal regulation, and they've found that actually if they jump between trees, they could be, their fall could be slowed somewhat. So alternative explanation of protein stability. So if we consider this mapping from genotype to phenotype, we have this large redundancy of genotypes that map to phenotype, right? So many, many genotypes give us the same protein fold. So what you can do, so people have done this, you take a particular protein fold and you ask, let me look at all the sequences for that fold. You essentially sort of constrain it to that structure. You say, let me look at all the different sequences, yep, and then what's the stability of those sequences? Okay? So in some sense, this gives us like a null distribution for what evolution has to work with. Okay? Like our constraint, like the spandrels. Okay? And so if we look at this, we see that stability is massively peaked at very poor stabilities. Okay? And if we zoom in at this peak where you actually get stable structures, we see that there's there's a tendency towards getting less and less stable proteins. There's a peak in the opposite direction. So the key thing is that actually, yes, natural selection might be taking us towards more stable proteins, but the role of genetic drift at some population size is to take in the opposite direction. Okay? So you can't get this maximum stability because it's just really, really hard to find. Right? So you may eventually get there, but then there's new mutations keep arising and take you in the opposite direction. Right? And so the prediction this gives, so the role of genetic drift is controlled by the population size. So if we decrease the population size, we get more and more randomness. And so it suggests that proteins should become less stable as we decrease population size. And this is actually what you find, at least in simulations. Okay? So there's two different types of simulations, protein stability and this evolutionary process. And you see that the stability goes down as a function of increases as a function of increasing population size, or decreases as you decrease the population size. So really the picture we need to have is not that we get to some optimum, but actually we explore this like fitness plane. Yeah? There's a certain plane of fitness, some mean fitness, which controls the different evolutionary possibilities. And then the key thing is that the distance from the optimum is controlled by the population size, 1 over the population size. So we keep decreasing population size, we get further and further away. And so lots and lots of the features we see are not because they're adaptive, but actually because we're exploring this plane. And so it turns out, like we can talk about the free energy telling us about the minimum free energy structures, there are many years ago showed that we can define something called a phenotypic entropy, which is just a log of the number of states that give us a given genotype. And we can define something called a free fitness. And actually evolution maximizes, in a certain evolutionary type of model, or process, phenotypes maximize free fitness. So there's a balance between entropy and fitness. The same way you have a balance between energy and entropy, thermodynamic entropy. So in this case, temperature is analogous to the inverse population size. How am I doing for time?
15 minutes.
Cool. So, let me do some work. Right, so some of my own work has been focused on trying to apply these ideas to models of developmental biology. So here we have a developing embryo. It's a Drosophila embryo, and it's very early stages, and we see all these different cells. And what typically happens is that the mother implants a particular protein at one end. That protein then diffuses into the rest of the embryo, and it provides a positional cue to say, okay, there's this program that can then basically develop, and gene regulation that can happen to give us further patterning of the embryo. And so I'm not going to go into the details of this, but if you have, I create this model that basically has proteins doing gene regulation, and we have, the key thing is we have a genotype, and we have an output phenotype that tries to take our morphogen gradient and find the center of embryo, for example, or do some sort of patterning. It turns out when you look at the fitness landscape of this thing, even though it's actually a relatively simple, real gene regulatory networks are nowhere near that simple, okay? But for a simple one, we see that the fitness landscape has this remarkable complexity to it, okay? So here we see that as we go towards larger morphogen gradients, we get better fitness because you get sharper profiles, okay? And we see the peak of the landscapes, the fitness landscapes up here somewhere. But as we decrease the population size, we see that actually we shift more and more towards less optimum values. And so, so what's basically happening is that we have a high entropy, there's more and more states on the left-hand side, which gives you poor patterning, but there's a lower entropy for the higher fitness states, okay? And there's a balance between those two things. And it turns out one of the predictions of this model is that you get more rapid speciation as a function of population size. As you decrease population size, organisms are already somewhat maladapted, and so when they diverge, speciation basically means they can no longer reproduce, right? If you've got two different lineages, they can no longer reproduce, and this happens more rapidly. Well, the prediction is that it happens more rapidly. Okay, so to finish our discussion about physics and evolution, we want to come back to this bigger question, okay, of what can physics tell us about evolution as a process, as a phenomenon of life, and why is it we have life on Earth? Okay, so what the question is, so if you have this prebiotic chemistry on early Earth, and we have now, in present day, Darwinian evolution, what happened in between? How did we get there? And what are the physics principles behind that? So what physics theory can both explain something that takes us from simple prebiotic chemistry to some sort of selection process to fully fledged Darwinian selection. And so to recap on what we have now, Darwinian evolution says we have organisms that have natural selection going on. So life is a reproducing organism that carries information on how to survive in a given environment. That's fitness. Selection is basically those organisms that have the best information on how to survive, which is basically survival of the fittest. The mutations are random changes in that information. Mutation plus selection then gives you adaptation to the best information. And then drift is this process of non-optimality. You're randomly sampling these alleles, and so you can't always get to the best information. So it's very natural to talk about origin of life, and so the early Earth was very tumultuous, lots of thunderstorms and so forth. So the early ideas about the origin of life were revolved around having this idea that, you know, there's a large, massive input of energy from electricity, from lightning, that then formed the spark of life, a bit like in the Frankenstein sense, right? And this is what the Miller-Urey experiments did. So they took water, methane, ammonia and hydrogen, and essentially put sparks across these gases, mix of gases, and they actually did manage to produce intermediates of cyanide and formaldehyde, and that turned into simple amino acids of glycine and alanine, which is quite promising, yeah? But actually nowadays, I think the more common view is that life probably evolved in a situation more like these hydrothermal deep sea vents. So the video playing, yep. And we see here, there's energy and chemicals basically being fed on by these organisms. So there's a route to life, okay? So the key idea is that life evolved with a continuous energy source. It didn't just come from a spark. There's a continual energy flow which led to some conditions to allow life to arise, and some sort of selection process. In this case, it's thought these organisms survive off chemosynthesis, so it could have been the same thing for the origin of the first life. So the key physics idea, though, is that if you have a system where you have some chemical reactions going on, okay, as we put energy into a system and there's heat coming out, the flow of energy itself leads to preferred paths in space in this chemical reaction networks. So there's some sort of degree of prebiotic selection going on. And so this idea I talked about, redundancy and entropy of pathways and genotypes and things like that, could play a role here, particularly how it couples to stochasticity. And so one of the key ideas, achievements in the past, I would say 20 years of statistical mechanics was by, I keep saying Garth Crooks, but it's not Garth Crooks, it's Gavin Crooks, who showed that if you take some bunch of molecules or something, and you ask, okay, how can it assemble? What path does it take to assemble? And then you say, okay, let me take that thing which is assembled and look at the reverse path, how it deassembles along exactly the same route but reversed in time. The ratio of the probabilities of these two things happening is proportional to the heat flow into the environment. And so, more recently, Jeremy England has tried to use this idea to say this gives rise to something called dissipative-driven adaptation, where paths in space which dissipate more energy and sort of have some sort of resonance with the energy are the ones that are preferred. I don't know if you've heard of that guy. There's a lot of hoo-ha about him and being like the next Darwin and so forth. So this is one idea, an important element. So this is a video I took on US Beach in the Outer Hebrides. So what do you see?
Sand blowing across an undulating beach.
Yeah, well, there's actually water there.
Oh.
So there's water flowing across this beach, okay? So what's happening is the water is flowing because of the configuration of the sand. Yeah, it flows in a particular pattern because of the configuration of the pattern. But as the water flows, it changes the configuration of the sand, which in turn changes the flow of water. So there's a cycle, there's a feedback. Okay? So like I said here, flow of water is caused by the configuration of sand, which in turn changes the configuration of sand, and so on and so forth. And this is a metaphor for life. So So there's no fitness function. So we're physicists, we don't want fitness functions. We want these things to emerge. And so it's a metaphor for organisms that survive in a given environment, which have changed their environment, which then further affects their survival in the future. And so the key thing about this is that it gives rise to the potential for open-ended variation for evolution, which is one of the key aspects we need for some sort of physics-type theory of life. Right, so everyone must have seen this. Tell me if I'm running out of time. Right. Has everyone seen this? I think you have to be a certain age to have seen this. 4 candles, please. 4 candles. Sure, 4 candles. No, handles for forks. Right? So, communicating information is very, really important, right? And if there's noise and there's misconceptions, then it's hard to do that. Right, so this was the whole topic, in some sense, of Claude Shannon and his information theory. And he developed the whole theory behind, what if you tried to communicate zeros and ones across some sort of communication channel, and it introduces noise, and so the receiver receives a corrupted version of the bits you're trying to send. Okay? So his crowning achievement was to show that there's a speed limit to how fast we can communicate across this channel. It turns out to be log of the 1 plus the signal to noise ratio. And you can, basically what he did was to maximize something called the mutual information between the transmitter and the receiver, which is a form of correlation. Yeah. Mutual information is just like a nonlinear correlation. And it turns out, quite remarkably, that if you communicate at a rate less than that, then he showed that there exists a way of doing it such that it's completely error-free. 0 error. It's one of the most remarkable things I think, you know. So I've studied physics and theoretical physics. There's clearly lots of remarkable things, but this is one of the remarkable things outside of physics, which is fundamental to everything we see, you know, our mobile phones and, you know, and how we communicate over the internet. And actually, if you go through the proof, it's one of the most beautiful proofs too. It involves basically packing hyperdimensional spheres in larger hyperdimensional spheres, and it's really nice. Right, so there's an idea that life is a bit like this, okay? It's got information in its genome, which is trying to transmit into the future, okay? Over some sort of noisy communication channel. And this is an idea put forward by Eric Smith and Harold Moritz in this book. And here, the communication channel is essentially reproduction and selection, and the noise is from mutation and genetic drift. So how can we communicate? So the whole thing is life persists, right? It keeps going into the future. And how do we do that? What are the systems? What are the processes that allow us to essentially communicate to the future error-free? And so there's a recent result by a guy called Bill Barak and Ilya Nemenin, I think. And they showed that you can create a quantity of information theory quantity called predictive information, which is basically just the mutual information between, or the correlation between the past and the future. And it turns out that this has certain nice properties to it, which suggests that it could be, so there's this idea that, you know, clearly in life, over evolutionary, you know, many billions of years, life has been evolving more and more complexity, okay? But actually, it's very difficult to define a good complexity measure. And they suggest it's a very good complexity measure because it tells us about structural correlations which persist over time. So it gets rid of all the noise, so there's like correlations just by randomness over time, and this just tells us about the stuff which actually persists. And it turns out Suzanne Steele showed that if you've got a system, which has any non-predictive memory, which doesn't help you predict the future, it's always dissipative. It dissipates more energy, which is a very important result, I think. Right, so towards an emergent theory of physics theory of evolution. So we want it to be a statistical physics of non-equilibrium, of a non-equilibrium driven system. So for example, it needs deep sea thermal vents. And some of the properties it needs to have, it has memory and prediction, which eventually gives us something like DNA. But how can that emanate before we actually get DNA? How can we get persistent structures? Selection versus entropy, as I talked about, which tell us about different redundancies and pathways and how it interacts with stochasticity, and open-ended variation. This interaction between organism and the environment to give us this diversity of life on Earth we see today. And the key thing, persistence of life. So I'll leave you with this final thought. How is it that evolution sustained life for 4 billion years? And so the final thing I have, so everyone knows what a Rube Goldberg machine is. So the way I think about this is a bit like a Rube Goldberg machine. You're about to find out what it is, if it plays. I'm not sure if there's any sound. It's not critical. So Rube Goldberg machine is an artificially constructed series of things which affect other things, which affect another thing, which affect another thing, which go on and go on and go on and go on. Yeah? But the question about life is essentially it's very, very similar, but it emerged from the laws of physics. So how can we get some sort of similar phenomenon but from the laws of physics? Let you watch this for a bit. We don't have to watch the whole thing, of course, but That must take a lot of effort. Cool.